You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Brian VanDeMark. He teaches history at the United States Naval Academy. He's the author of several books on American history. He co-authored Robert McNamara's best-selling Vietnam memoir, In Retrospect. And if you haven't read that book, or the follow-up, Argument Without End, I think that's what it's called, please do so. It's terrific history. Professor VanDeMark is on the podcast today to discuss a book that taught me as much about one particular incident as any book I've ever read. The book is titled Kent State, An American Tragedy. Professor, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You obviously have a distinguished, not only roster of academic accomplishments, but books, published books as well. Kent State, why did that catch your eye? And why is it a uniquely American tragedy?
I was nearly 10 years old when it happened. I remember seeing the front pages of the newspapers. I remember the shocking effect that incident had on the American people. And when the 50th anniversary came around in May of 2000, it reignited my interest in the topic because the lingering questions concerning the shooting remained. And I wanted to endeavor to try to address and answer them. It's a particular tragedy because you have Americans confronting other Americans and killing other Americans on American soil.
How would that differ, say, from any of the riots that took place, let's say, from the end of the Civil War, which is 1865, up until sort of the Vietnam period? There were draft riots. There were obviously significant racial and civil unrest. New York City had its share of issues, Chicago, some of the other big cities. What makes Kent State different?
Let me begin by reminding everyone that the Vietnam War was the most divisive issue in American history of the 20th century. It divided the American people more deeply than anything since the American Civil War. And the Kent State incident has particular elements of drama and tragedy because you have American students confronting American servicemen, leading to an outbreak of violence that was just indescribably shocking to Americans at the time. The other thing I would point out is it's a metaphor for the deep division of the country in the late 60s and early 70s because of the Vietnam War. And the parallels to today in terms of mood and division within the country are powerful and sobering.
It's fair to say, to characterize as what happened, that in reading your book, there were clearly, and we'll get into all this in a minute, but clearly confrontations, the emotions ran high and low. There were people who you could certainly label as agitators. There were certainly people who you could label as conciliators. But on May 4th, 1970, none of the sort of compromise worked. What pushed against the sense of compromise and let's let these kids protest the war? That's their right. And then we can go on to the next day and the next thing. What made that impossible on that day?
Part of it's the emotional atmosphere in the country in 1970 and over the Vietnam War and the deep divisions it engendered, and the particularly intense emotional atmosphere in American university campuses, an era when there was a draft in effect. And that was a powerful element to all of this, because up until 1969, college students were exempt from the draft. And I think that created a mixture of emotions and perceptions on the part of college students about those who were serving in their place, about what they perceived very often as an unjust and unnecessary war. That exemption was lifted in 1969. So by the spring of 1970, those college students on the campus of Kent State in May of that year are now vulnerable. They are now susceptible to being drafted and sent to Vietnam. So their perceptions of the war, their complicated emotional complexion regarding conscription, all of that intensifies the atmosphere and creates an element, a milieu of crisis and confrontation that contributed powerfully to the inevitable tragedy that occurred that day.
One of the things that you point out so well and not divulge, but dive into is the fact that not only were the students young Americans, but so were the guardsmen. And I thought that was a very powerful point, that without taking sides, of course, where you're like, oh yeah, the student was 21, but one of the guardsmen was 21 too. And like you mentioned, the students are scared because they think they're going to go to Vietnam, and the guardsmen are scared because they have to try to create some sort of peaceful situation out of chaos. How did the relative youth, the fact that they're the same age, how did it promote communication and how did it inhibit communication?
I think the point you made is an important one, and it deepens the sense of tragedy here. Many of those who served in the Ohio National Guard in May of 1970 were there because they wanted to avoid the draft and being sent to Vietnam. So in that sense, their politics were not all that different from the student protesters that were confronting them that day. I think another very important element here was they were woefully inadequately trained for crowd control, and the leadership displayed that day by the senior officer of the Ohio National Guard on campus, Assistant Adjutant General Robert Canterbury, was indescribably incompetent. And I think that's a very dangerous mixture. You have a tense emotional atmosphere. You have guardsmen who are trained, frankly, to kill, not to perform crowd control functions. They don't have the instruments to perform nonviolent crowd control. All they're armed with are rifles with live ammunition, and they're being led by, quite frankly, an incompetent fool.
Lack of leadership permeates this entire incident, but also the policies that led to lighting this keg. Take us back. I was born in 1967, so I don't remember Kent State. I do remember the fall of Saigon. That's like the first Vietnam-related marker I can remember. But what was the feeling of, we've just come out of the World War II generation. So you have Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Marshall, Bradley, the list goes on. All these leaders who led us on this great crusade against fascism and the Holocaust and everything associated with that. But here we are just 25 years later after the end of the war, and there seems to be a significant lack of leadership. Was that something that the college students emphasized or thought of? Why can't we come up with someone?
As I mentioned in the introductory chapter where I set the scene, the baby boomers and most of the college students in the United States in 1970 were right in the middle of the baby boom. They'd been brought up as children in an era in which the good guys won a great war over evil in World War II. The forces of light had conquered the forces of darkness. It was simple. And it created, I think, an impression on their part that that's the norm, that the United States always did the right thing and it always won. The problem that emerged was the Vietnam War was an extraordinarily complex and frustrating commitment that became a very expensive endeavor for the United States in terms of blood and treasure. And I think that had a profound effect on the generation of baby boomers who had been brought up in this idealized atmosphere, because they're now confronting a United States, an American government, and a leadership of this country that, compared to the greatest generation, was woefully inadequate in comparison. And I think that troubled them, and it probably fed much of their frustration and resentment.
Is that part of the reason why? Are you okay? Just checking. Are you make sure before I move on? Are you okay?
I'm fine. Thank you.
That's all right. Let's talk broader, and I'll edit that part, so don't worry about it.
Okay.
Let's talk a little bit about the conflict in Vietnam. The roots are in colonialism. The French try to reassert their dominance over Vietnam, Southeast Asia after World War II. They're defeated finally in 1954, I think, Dien Bien Phu. The Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration take an interest in Vietnam. Certainly the activity, the commitment, the investment under Kennedy grows from where it was under Eisenhower. There's obviously the debate I mentioned earlier that I had interviewed Professor Silverstone about the Kennedy withdrawal. What would Kennedy have done, President Kennedy, had he lived? But moving beyond that, past 63, you have, what is clearly a watershed with the involvement and the investment and deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops from the United States to Vietnam. Why was Vietnam seen as so important to merit this investment, as you said, of blood and treasure?
In many respects, it was a logical outgrowth of the global containment policy that was supported by presidents of both parties beginning in the years after World War II up through the early to mid-60s. The problem in terms of Vietnam was the complexity of the situation, the lack of any kind of substantive political viability in South Vietnam, and the nature of the war. Once the United States became involved in the war militarily, the disadvantages of being an established high-tech military colossus were exposed because their adversaries had the intelligence and wisdom to essentially go asymmetrical on their superior foe. They understood that they could never defeat the United States military in battle in open fields, so they very quickly stopped attempting to do so. And they adopted a guerrilla strategy, which was frankly and ironically quite similar to what George Washington and the Continental Army did against the British during this Revolutionary War. You have to combine that with the fact that the draft exists. You and I live in an era going on 51 years now where there's been no draft in the United States. Having a draft, exposing young Americans to service in harm's way in a war, intensifies the politicization of the war in terms of its perceptions by the American people. It was a very divisive war as each year went by. The center collapsed, and you will see as the 60s give way to the early 70s that people who opposed the war are moving far to the left, and those who supported are moving far to the right, which means the ability for both sides to understand or communicate with one another is diminishing. And the other important and tragic thing is the bloodiest years of the war for the United States were 1968 and 1969. And this occurs in May of 1970.
You mentioned the draft. The draft had been going on, been a part of American history, American military history for a century before Vietnam. Why was this draft, this manifestation of the draft, why was it such a catalyst to unrest?
There are many reasons for that. I think part of it, as I described before, is the complexity and frustrations of the war itself. Part of that, too, is the psychology and outlook of baby boomers. I think they had been brought up to view things in black and white terms, and they were discovering that it's not always. I think also, and this is powerfully important, Vietnam was the first and last uncensored war. It was the first and last time that the United States government and the United States military allowed the American people to see what war really is. And it's what I call the pornography of violence.
Mm.
The destruction, the death, the bloodshed, the anguish, the innocents who were hurt. It's all there. And the American people saw that in vivid color. And I think that had a profound effect on their perception of the war and their attitude toward America's commitment to the war. And the lesson that's been drawn from that ever since is the United States military will not allow the media to convey to the American people what war really looks like.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We are talking Kent State, An American Tragedy, a new book by Professor Brian VanDeMark. You mentioned the draft and how it pulled people into a war, a situation that they otherwise probably wouldn't have volunteered to do. But the draft, as you mentioned earlier, didn't pull everyone in. What was the atmosphere? Those of us, I joined the Army in 87. My son joined the Army about 20 years later. He did 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat infantryman. He volunteered. I volunteered. My 2 brothers volunteered. The list goes on. Niece and nephew. But to be drafted, the son of a steel worker, for example, and know that your friend, the son of an accountant who's now at Kent State, doesn't have to go. How did that divide serve as an accelerant for the atmosphere, for the dispute, the sense of the haves and have-nots?
I think you make the point pretty well yourself. Until college exemptions were lifted in 1969, there was a class element to the U.S. conscription system. Effectively, what it did was it exposed those who could not afford to go to college to the draft and service in Vietnam in a way that if you were a middle-class son or an upper-middle-class son or an upper-class son and you were in college, you were free from all of those risks and dangers. And I think that created a very complex and intense emotional mixture on the part of those who got drafted and those who were exempted. And what's really sad is that division and mutual hostility in some respects that was born during that era of the Vietnam War, frankly, persists to this very day on the part of many of that generation. Those who served in Vietnam, in many cases, cannot abide those who avoided the draft, and those who viewed the war as a mistake at best and a monstrous error at worst, developed a hatred for the military that in some instances persists to this day as well.
We've talked about Vietnam and the global fight against communism. We could go down the domino theory rabbit hole if we wanted, but we won't. We talked about the United States a little bit in the atmosphere. Let's focus on Kent State. How typical was Kent State in terms of its student activism during this period of time? We read about Columbia and Berkeley and some of those places. Did Kent State, was it in the middle of the Venn diagram, or was it a little more fiery?
It's hard to give you a precisely accurate answer other than to say that, like many American college campuses, as the 60s went by, America's frustration in Vietnam became a protracted one, and the casualty rate went up. Opposition to the war on campuses increased generally across the board. And as I pointed out in the early part of the book, in 1967, 1968, it's not schools like Kent State and the heartland of America that are becoming flamboyantly critical of the war. That would be the case in Columbia, New York, and Berkeley, Madison, the University of Wisconsin. But by 1970, opposition to the war, I think it's safe to generalize, was a very prevalent attitude on the part of the majority of college students across the land.
Was Kent State's administration or the town leadership equipped to deal with a heightening of the intensity of the protests?
I think one thing to keep in mind is the background here is that the town of Kent, Ohio, was a traditional conservative middle American town. The population of the community of Kent were much more familiar with traditional American values, and they found the emergence of this anti-war critique and the counterculture that went with it profoundly disconcerting, alienating, and dangerous. The administration at Kent, they were in a tough spot from the beginning. I think they were close enough to the students to understand their point of view and their frustrations. They were riding a tiger. And one of the tragedies of this story is that the administration of the university, because they understood the mood of the students best, were much more inclined to rely on their university police force, if necessary, the town police force, in extremis, the Ohio State Highway Patrol, but not the National Guard. Because I think they understood that if you deploy a lot of force in a very tense situation, that tends to have a provocative impact. And the governor of Ohio at the time, James Rhodes, made a decision to go with the Guard. And when those who knew the situation of the mood on campus best privately told him, "You're playing with dynamite," he brushed them off. He didn't consult or listen to the university administration. It would have told him the National Guard is not the answer. If anything, it's just going to pour fuel on the flames.
And to your point that you made earlier and you make in the book, whatever you think of campus police, city police, state police, they have some training in riot control, and the guardsmen did not. How quickly did that become, and I don't want to get ahead, but forgive me for asking this question before I don't forget to ask it. How quickly did, when they were deployed in early May of 1970, how quickly did this deficiency of training become apparent?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that they arrived in Kent on Saturday night, May 2nd, at the time that the ROTC building on campus was put to the torch. There was a confrontation with some students that night, but the following day, Sunday, May 3rd, there was a level of amity and communication between the guardsmen and the students, which was remarkable. Most of those guardsmen didn't want to be there because I think in their heart of hearts, they understood they were not really well trained to perform the function they were being asked to perform. They were the same generation as the students. They fraternized with one another. On Sunday afternoon, it seemed like things were calming down. And yet, it's probably the younger guardsmen, the enlisted ranks, who understood the students best, and the guard personnel who understood them the least and were least empathetic were the leadership, particularly Assistant Adjutant General Robert Canterbury. He had served in World War II brilliantly. He had combat experience. He meant well, but he was not the right person to exercise the crucial leadership role on May 4th because he did not feel empathy for the students. I think he had difficulty understanding their point of view, and he made choices and judgments that put the guardsmen in an impossible situation.
Part of Canterbury's, and I want to ask you about the cast of characters in just a minute, was part of, I hate to say this because it's probably wrong, but when I was reading your book, and every time Canterbury came through, all I could think of was Archie Bunker. Not that Canterbury was a racist or anything like that, as far as we know, but the generational mindset. I'm sure Canterbury was like, there's no way I would have avoided service after Pearl Harbor, after Okinawa, and whatever the battle was. What is wrong with these kids? Don't they understand? And I just got the sense through your really perceptive writing that he had, to your point, and neither did Rhodes, all these people who came alive or suffered through the Great Depression. Then they suffer through World War II, one way or the other. They lost their father. They lost their brother. They served in combat. And they're looking at these kids with long hair who were protesting and calling cops pigs and F the establishment and all that. To me, there is as much a mental, emotional, and intellectual and generational divide in the late 60s, early 70s than there has been in any other period in American history. And I know I'm not breaking new ground there, but it really comes home in your book how much different these two generations are.
It's very eloquently put. And what really troubles me and frightens me is that much of what you just said could be applicable to the America of today.
Meaning that there are, to me, the divides today, and we've had some podcasts about this, is so fueled by technology that it makes it a bit more incendiary. And that's not even a criticism. It's just the acknowledgement of reality. Much as you mentioned a few minutes ago, television bringing home what was happening in Hue and other places in Vietnam. How much did technology make a difference back then because you had more ways to stay in touch, to organize, to see what was happening on the campuses and on the battlefield?
I think the first point I want to stress is that today, as then, there was a profound cultural divide in the country. It wasn't just a political divide, it was a cultural divide. And when you combine those two, it's a recipe for misunderstanding, miscommunication, and an utter lack of empathy for the other, which is a recipe for disaster. Neither side was willing to put themselves in the other person's shoes. And I think that contributed centrally to the tragedy. And that same kind of mixture is at work today. As you pointed out, the difference is today in the age of the internet and social media, the ability for people to communicate and magnify and amplify their point of view and their criticisms and their hatreds of someone or something else is much greater. But even then, as I said before, the center had collapsed in this country by the 1970, utterly collapsed. And that's where you find the potential for dialogue, for those who have the temperamental willingness to listen to the other side, try to understand their point of view, try to communicate with one another and attempt to find some kind of common ground and avoid violence.
And the work to find common ground isn't just too often absent. It's also frequently ridiculed.
Yes.
You have rhinos, dinos, the list goes on, even back into the 60s. I had a history professor in graduate school. My graduate degree's in medieval history, so it was actually on point. He said the greatest invention, without a doubt, of all time is the printing press. He says that changed everything, not just the Reformation, but everything that came after it. And the internet is just the 21st century manifestation of the printing press. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our discussion today is with Professor Brian VanDeMark. We are discussing his book, Kent State, An American Tragedy. It is absolutely terrific for those of you who were old enough or are old enough to remember the event and the atmosphere in which it took place, and those of us who are younger who seek to understand what America was like pretty much the last time we were in the spot we're in now in some ways. Are there some particular people that you want readers of your book or listeners of this podcast to know more about? Cast of characters, people who were there, who were involved in it, who you think played some of the leading roles?
I'll mention a few, but it's not an exhaustive list by any means. The county prosecutor of Portage County, Ron Kane, in many respects was prophetic and heroic. On Sunday afternoon, May 3rd, when Governor Rhodes publicly adopted a confrontational attitude toward protests on campus and stressed the use of the National Guard as a coping mechanism for that, Kane privately pleaded with the governor to close the campus, pointing out with very salty language that someone was probably going to get killed if he didn't. Rhodes made a different choice. Some of the senior officers under Canterbury at Kent State on May 4th, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Fassinger, Major Jones, Harry Jones, in many respects served admirably that day. They had reservations about what they were being asked to do. They saw the limitations in Canterbury's leadership abilities. They empathized, frankly, with the point of view of the student protesters. And I do believe if they had been asked, should we disperse this crowd? Should we contemplate the use of force as a solution to this problem? They would have said, don't do it. But you've served in the military. It's a hierarchy. It's not a campfire circle where people sit around and debate things. Canterbury was the officer in charge, and his word was law. And he exercised woefully poor judgment that day.
And there was, is it fair to say, after the 1968 presidential election, in subsequent ones, even though in 1970 the Republicans took a bit of a bloody nose in the midterms, say after 68 that there was a political benefit to be seen as tough on these punks, these hippies, these ingrates. Do you sense that was part of some of the thinking of the leadership? In other words, if I back down and I let these guys, these kids, they've already burnt the ROTC building on May 2nd. If I let them control things, I'm going to be seen as a weak leader. But if I bend them to my will through whatever means, then I'll be seen as someone who's tough and a take control leader who respects America.
I think you put it pretty well. I can't presume to put myself in the head of Governor Rhodes or General Canterbury, but the cultural war that's underway at this point, combined with the confrontational atmosphere and the political opportunities, shall we say, that are created by adopting a let's get tough stance here, were a very dangerous mixture. Another interesting thing to me is that if polls had been taken canvassing the citizenry of Ohio in the days after May 4th, the vast majority of them would have supported what the Guard did. If polls were taken nationally after May 4th, and those polls indicated the American people as a whole were critical of what the Guard had done.
That is a part of your book that I find. You could have taken a poll, commissioned 100 polls, and I've worked in politics my whole life, and the sample or the geography or the demography of the poll participants would have told you would have foretold everything you're about to read in the poll results. That was, to me, as you describe it, indicative of the divide.
Yes.
It's May 4th, it's 1970. We talked about Vietnam a few minutes ago. There is a proximate event in Southeast Asia which fuels, not just at Kent State, but throughout the country, an intensification of the protests, of the violence in some ways, and an intensification of the divide. What is that? What is that event?
It's President Nixon's decision to send U.S. military forces into Cambodia. He had already made an overarching decision due to the pressure of public opinion to begin the withdrawal of American military forces from South Vietnam. He had run in 1968 on a vague promise to have a plan to end the war. And I would say that it's a safe generalization that by the spring of 1970, there was no longer any real debate about whether the United States should continue the military effort there, but how fast and at what rate we should get out. As a result of his decision to begin withdrawing troops, the American commander in Vietnam, General Abrams, told him that if you're going to draw down American military forces in South Vietnam, you need to protect that process by disabling the sanctuaries that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese are using in Cambodia. And it was on that basis that Nixon made the decision to send U.S. forces into Cambodia. The effect of that, though, and I think he anticipated this privately, was combustible. The reason for that was he had run as a candidate with a plan to end the war in 1968. And for a lot of students on the campus of Kent State and across the country, including those in some instances who were veterans themselves of the Vietnam War, they're thinking to themselves, well, wait a minute. This guy said he's trying to reduce America's involvement in the war, and here he goes sending American forces into Cambodia, which is expanding it. As I said, it was just adding aviation jet fuel to the flames.
And there was a lot of sympathy for Cambodia, kind of peaceful, perceived to be peaceful country in the middle of all this chaos and killing. One quick question, militarily, because Nixon had drawn down, well, we got about 550,000. Is that kind of the peak soldier number, close to it in Vietnam? He had got drawn down and taken 250, 300,000 troops out by then, or close, like he had started maybe 200,000. He had started the process, as you said. His policy of Vietnamization to me always smacked of Eisenhower. I will go to Korea. Very vague, isn't really going to do much per se. But his excursion into Cambodia, from a military perspective, was it at all, in your view, and more about this than anyone, was it justifiable?
Well, I don't know more about this than anyone, and I'm not a military historian. I'm not an expert, but I will say this. To some degree, he's responding to pressure put on him by the American commander in Vietnam, but that's part of the job of being president of the United States. Is you have to balance and weigh all of these conflicting pressures. And wars should never be fought for anything other than particular political ends. And the judgment of the American people, the overwhelming majority of the American people by the spring of 1970 was, it's time for the United States of America to disengage from South Vietnam. And to the degree that Nixon was withdrawing troops, I don't know the exact numbers, probably sure, at least 100,000 by the end of 1969, and more were being withdrawn in the spring of 1970. That means there's still a lot of American forces there in the spring of 1970. He faced the contradiction of responding to the wishes of the American people to end this endeavor at the same time that he's getting private warnings from his military commander that in order to do so, you're going to need to protect their withdrawal by reducing the pressure being put on them by the communist sanctuaries in Cambodia.
May 2nd, 1970, the ROTC building at Kent State was firebombed, a fair way to put it, or maybe that's too strong.
Put to the torch. It was, yeah. It was a very protracted one. It took him a while to put it aflame, but it was in total flames by the time the National Guard arrived around 9:30 to 10 o'clock that night.
So on May 2nd, is it fair to call the protesters the aggressors? That there was some need to have law enforcement control over the campus, if not necessarily military control?
I think an important point to stress is that those who set fire to the ROTC building were a very small number of people.
And they may not even have been students.
Perhaps not. They probably were, but they were very small in number. I would say that a much, much larger number of students at Kent State by May of 1970 were antipathetic toward the presence of ROTC on campus, or not been out of shape by the fact that the building went up in flames, but would have had nothing to do with setting it a torch.
And you mentioned May 3rd, the day before the shootings, was a day of amnesty, or at least a day of taking the pressure out of the tire so it's not going to explode. There could be some way to resolve this. But let's move on to Monday. Is it Monday, May 4th?
Yes.
Monday, May 4th, 1970. The weather was beautiful?
Yes.
That is such a theme of American history. You look at the video of September 11th, it's a beautiful fall day. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, not a cloud in the sky. It's May 4th, 1970. As dawn breaks and the morning develops, what is the situation at Kent State? And what are leaders on both sides? What are they hoping for?
The students, of course, as we've discussed, were in many instances very opposed to the war and critical of the war. The arrival of the National Guard, to some degree, intensified that antipathy because from the students' point of view, they were being occupied. From their point of view, their constitutional right to dissent and free speech was being threatened and impinged on by Governor Rhodes's deployment of the National Guard to their campus. There was a decision made by Canterbury that morning to disperse the crowd of anti-war protesters who had gathered on the commons of the university. He later alleged that the president of the university, Robert White, was the one who essentially forced him to make the decision to disperse the crowd. The evidence is preponderant in the direction that it was Canterbury's decision to do.
And at the order of disperse, had violence at any kind of confrontation already taken place that day?
None whatsoever. And what's particularly sobering is many of the guardsmen who were there watched the students and thought they're making a lot of noise, having some fun. I may agree with him, I may disagree with him, but they're not posing a violent threat. Most of the guardsmen were uncomfortable with the idea of dispersing the crowd. And you didn't have to have a PhD in mathematics to realize that they were vastly outnumbered, probably in the neighborhood of 30-1, which itself creates a certain psychological dynamic. These guardsmen who are poorly trained to do what they're about to be asked to do are seriously outnumbered, which probably intensified their insecurity, their anxiety, their fear, and their jumping. It's all a recipe for disaster.
They were also in possession of the force multipliers, the guns, the rifles, the bullets.
Yes.
In the chronology, is it fair to say that the morning was relatively peaceful? The guard was ordered to disperse the students, the protesters, or the protesters were annoyingly violent without deadly so. Then the National Guard got the order to disperse.
There had been a confrontation between student protesters and the National Guard on campus near downtown the night before, in which words were exchanged and some physical violence occurred on both sides. I think that raised the temperature quite a lot. I think there were a significant number of students who, by the morning of Monday, realized that something was going to happen. The tension was simply too high. The animosity back and forth was too intense. So that's the atmosphere in which all this is about to happen. And I think, too, as I've said before, the senior guard officers under Canterbury questioned the wisdom of his decision to order the guard to disperse the crowd in the commons. But he didn't seek their judgment, and they were his subordinates, so they were forced to do as they were told to do. Loading their M1 rifles with live ammunition, which Canterbury allowed. Hindsight's always 20/20. That was stupendously poor judgment on Canterbury's part. And
Really the watershed of the day.
It's unbelievable in a sense. And ironically, Canterbury's president intensified their anxiety as well. He's the number 2 in the entire Ohio National Guard hierarchy. Guard generals rarely deployed to the field. There's the general. He's not wearing a uniform. He's wearing a suit. So many of them didn't even recognize who he was. And those who did said, "Oh my God, General Canterbury's here." What connection do they make there? Oh my goodness, this must be really serious and really dangerous, or the general wouldn't be here.
And to your point, he was a highly decorated combat veteran. So it's not a matter of a lack of personal heroism. It's more of a lack of
judgment.
Judgment. Another point you make, and it's interesting because I tried to remember this when I was in basic training because it was the only time I ever wore it. But in discussing equipment, you point out that the gas masks worn by a guardsman was a significant contributor to the confusion. Explain that a little bit to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience, because that's a brilliant piece of research.
These gas masks severely limited their vision, and many of these guardsmen wore glasses. They were forced to take their glasses off in order to don the gas mask. Their vision is impaired, their hearing is impaired by these gas masks. And I think both of those factors intensified their insecurity as things started to happen. As the confrontation with the students proceeded and the physical proximity of one to the other intensified. Here you've got nervous, poorly trained guardsmen carrying combat rifles with live ammunition, wearing gas masks, in which a crowd of student protesters who outnumber them 30-1 are shouting things at them, throwing things at them, and they can't see very well or hear commands very well. You look back on this now and it just makes you want to cry.
It's an incredible point of the book that you just, almost for want of a nail of discussion that I really hope the readers of your book pay attention to. I'm going to ask a question, then I'm going to hush up for 3 or 4 minutes as you take it through it that day. The order to put in live ammunition, there's an order to advance. Then what happens on May 4th, 1970 at Kent State?
Canterbury ordered the university police officer near him to grab a megaphone and essentially order the students to disperse. This was done repeatedly. The students didn't disperse. Therefore, Canterbury ordered the guard out to disperse them. They proceeded from the burned out ROTC barracks across the commons. The students backed up as they approached up Blanket Hill around both ends of Taylor Hall. And while all of this was happening, tear gas is being fired. The blood pressure and emotional temperature of the students and the guardsmen is increasing. Once the guard reached Blanket Hill, the students had been dispersed from the commons. The chaplain of one of the guard units there said to himself he had remained behind at the ROTC barracks. The students have been dispersed. Why is Canterbury proceeding over Blanket Hill toward the students? The mission has been accomplished. I've wondered that myself quite often. Even if deciding to order the guardsmen to disperse the students was questionable judgment, that had been achieved by the point that the guard had reached Blanket Hill. But Canterbury proceeded on. And again, hindsight's always 20/20. That was stupendously bad judgment. As the students backed down the other side of Blanket Hill toward the practice field and the parking lot in front of Prentice Hall, Canterbury split the guard right before Taylor Hall. He ordered roughly 40% to the left around the north end of Taylor Hall and 60% of them to the right around the south end of Taylor Hall. He stayed with the group to the south. The group to the left stopped halfway around Taylor Hall because a protester in a tree shouted expletives at the commanding officer of that group, who stopped and had a personal confrontation with them. Canterbury proceeded down Blanket Hill toward the practice field. So his numbers are already diminished now from 96, which would create a ratio of 30-1 to probably roughly half of that. So now the odds are 60-1 that they're outnumbered. They're being called names. Things are being thrown at them. They're being hit in some instances. They don't want to be there. They feel nervous and anxious, and they're carrying guns loaded with live ammunition. Some student protesters, small number of them, got fairly close to them when they were down on the practice field. And Canterbury ordered a group of guardsmen to kneel and point their rifles at these students as a warning to back off, stressing that no one was to fire. It's just a preventative measure to get these students who are getting near them to back off. and rocks were continuing to rain down on them and other debris. Canterbury made the decision to move the group under his command there on the practice field back up Blanket Hill, across the commons back to the barracks. As they retreated up Blanket Hill, students who had been protesting their presence started following them up the hill. I can't be precise in terms of numbers, but a few hundred. And as the guardsmen retreated up the hill, remember, they're wearing gas masks. So they're having to look over their right shoulder to see this group of students coming up behind them. They don't know how close they really are or how fast they're moving, but there are a lot of them. The students in front of them had been backing down Blanket Hill across the commons to avoid confrontation with the guard. But the students who were approaching them from their rear, up Blanket Hill from the parking lot, were getting closer. And I think at some point, as they neared the pagoda, which was off the southeast corner of Taylor Hall, a group of them who were on the right end of the line, who were closest to the students approaching them, turned and pointed their rifles downhill at the students, assuming in many instances that this would be a deterrent from students getting any closer, as they had done down on the practice field. There were a number of guardsmen behind the main line, a few of whom were not wearing gas masks. Two of the most important who were not wearing gas masks were Platoon Sergeant Matthew McManus and Major Harry Jones. Jones was closest to the cohort of guardsmen at the pagoda who turned. And he realized that things were getting very tense and the likelihood of something bad happening was increasing dramatically. Matthew McManus, who was a little bit downhill from that, could see that group of guardsmen turn because he wasn't wearing a gas mask. And he too realized that things were getting seriously dangerous. He made a decision at that point to raise his shotgun up in the air, and he issued an order as loudly as he could in an environment in which the bell clanging and noise making was intense. Fire in the air over their heads as a warning shot to get these students who were approaching them to stop. Jones had been moving close to those who had been pointing their rifles downhill, and McManus saw Jones approaching them, and that's what led him to make this decision to fire a warning shot. McManus did that in an effort to prevent bloodshed. The guardsmen had never been trained to fire warning shots. It was technically against guard regulations to fire a warning shot. And amidst all the noise, some guardsmen, or guardsmen plural, either heard or listened to only the first word.
Fire.
And that's what set it off.
Who are the victims of the shooting? The students, the protesters who were killed and injured?
4 were killed, 9 were injured, 1 permanently crippled for life.
The famous picture of, what's the story of the famous picture, which is not as of the copy I've received, on the cover of your book. And I thought that was an interesting decision. Use a different photo that's behind the guardsmen as they're walking towards or confronting or facing is probably a better word, the students. What is the story of the woman in the famous photo? I had no clue of her backstory till I read your book.
Mm-hmm. She was a 14-year-old runaway from Florida named Marianne Vecchio. She had reached Kent that weekend, and being 14 and attracted to the buzz and drama of student protests on campus, was there that day. She wasn't very far below Jeff Miller when he was shot in the left side of the face. And he pirouetted and stumbled 50 or so feet down the hill to the edge of the parking lot, where he fell face down, dying. Mary Vecchio came up to his, lying pavement, and she raised her arms in shock, anguish, and disgust. And that moment was captured by a photographer, and it's become the iconic symbol of the shooting.
It's also fair to say that it's one of the most iconic photos highlighting the generational divide, the angst, the anger about the Vietnam War, the universal why.
Yes. It symbolizes the tragedy, the human anguish and tragedy of that day.
It's the immediate aftermath of the shooting. What do the students, how do they react? How do the guardsmen and their leadership react?
After the shooting occurred, those guardsmen who were to proceeded down Blanket Hill across the commons back to the area in front of the burned out ROTC barracks. The student reaction to the shooting was utter disbelief, followed by sheer terror and panic. And after a few moments of that, mounting rage at what had happened, utter rage at what had happened. And hundreds of them followed the guardsmen down Blanket Hill. The students stopped in the commons and sat down. And some of them exchanged words like, "The revolution is on, let's have it out now." Some of them took their shirts off and painted crosshairs on their backs and their faces. They were ready for an ultimate showdown.
And the guardsmen?
The reaction of the guardsmen varied by individual, but I would say many of them were utterly horrified, confused, shocked, traumatized, and utterly revolted by what had happened. Some vomited, many of them put their guns down, some started walking away. And several guardsmen later said if they were asked to go out again to disperse this group of students on the common, probably 90% of them would have not been willing to do so.
What was the reaction throughout the United States and not necessarily the world, but perhaps the world and the media? This is the culmination of everything that's been happening in the previous decade.
You put it pretty well. It crystallizes all of the animosity, friction, division that had been building in the United States during the 1960s over the Vietnam War. It's when the war comes home. It's still shocking to say this, but American soldiers shot and killed American students on American soil. It, as others have pointed out before, it's the day the 60s died.
Yeah, I remember that quote from your book. I'd read in another book that a lady, a journalist in Los Angeles, had called the Tate LaBianca murders as the night the 60s ended or whatever. But you put it at May 4th, 1970.
The reason for that is the human suffering inflicted on Sharon Tate and others by Charles Manson's gang was unspeakable. But the media coverage of Kent State was stupendously intense. And these are ordinary American college students who've been shot and killed, wounded, some grievously, one paralyzed for life. And as the Justice Department later stated in a private memorandum, they had legal right to be there that day and to express their dissent against the war. And Canterbury transgressed that right by ordering them dispersed.
And the throwing of rocks and various other things did it influence how the media covered the event and how Americans reacted to it in the blame game that inevitably happens after any event, tragic event?
As you point out, and that's true. But as I think I mentioned before, I was struck by the dissonance between the reaction of most Ohioans, which was very sympathetic to the guards, and the American people generally were very critical of what had been done that day. But I think one important dimension of this story that I want people to contemplate is that it's a tragedy in countless ways, but the pain and suffering inflicted on the students by the shooting is obvious and speaks for itself. But a lot of those guardsmen were put in an unspeakably difficult situation and inflicted suffering on people that ended up creating suffering for them too.
We have just a few more minutes left with author Brian VanDeMark. We're discussing his superb book, Kent State, An American Tragedy. Did anybody involved on May 4th face criminal charges or pay a political price? I know Rhodes didn't, but what was the fallout beyond just the campus?
There were a small number of guardsmen who were eventually indicted on federal criminal charges and were brought to trial and acquitted. The judge issued a direct acquittal because he believed that the prosecution failed to prove intent on the part of the guardsmen that day, given the environment in which all this happened. There was a reasonable doubt in his mind that there was an intent by the guardsmen to inflict mortal injury on these students. The families of the victims were naturally disconcerted by that acquittal and pursued justice in the civil courts. There were 2 civil trials of the guardsmen and some of the leadership, including Governor Rhodes. In the first civil trial, they were acquitted again. There was an appeal filed over procedural issues that I'm not going to get into with you now, but that led to a second civil trial that was scheduled to get underway. And on the eve of the beginning of the second civil trial, a settlement was reached between the plaintiffs, the victims' families, and the defendants, the guardsmen, which brought the matter to a legal conclusion in 1978.
Many of the folks who were involved in this that day were wounded. Did you get a chance to interview, to talk to? And was it just a time warp of unspeakable power?
The victims, the 9 wounded students of May 4th, have been interviewed at length and exhaustively by dozens and dozens of journalists and historians over more than 50 years. Their perceptions, their reactions, their burdens, their suffering have been well covered by many previous writers on this topic. The missing piece here was the guard. Very few of them have ever spoken about what happened ever since that day, for a lot of reasons. Initially legal reasons, I think, and many other instances, legal and emotional reasons, psychological and emotional reasons. I reached out to every guardsman that I could identify who had been on Blanket Hill near the pagoda that day. I wrote them and requested an interview. Very few responded, but enough did to help me understand that side of this tragedy. Those who spoke to me were those who were at or near the pagoda but did not fire in the direction of the students or fire at all. Those who did fire in the direction of the students, none of them have spoken to me.
Did the ones who didn't fire articulate how close they were to firing in that atmosphere? The fear?
Yes, and it's a very sensitive topic. I'm going to be very careful in terms of summarizing what's in the book, because the quotes are direct from their willingness to talk to me.
Yes, sir.
But I will say this. I think that the reaction varied from individual to individual. And I think that not all of them, but some, if not most of them, felt that they were physically in great danger in the moments before the firing occurred. And most of them, in fact, all of them without exception, expressed regret and remorse for the victims, the students. And some of them pointed out that there were emotional and psychological victims among the guardsmen as well.
There were 2 people who were at the university that day who have gone on to significant fame and other endeavors. One of them is Chrissie Hynde,
yes,
who became the lead singer of the Pretenders. And the other is Nick Saban, probably the greatest college football coach of all time. Did you attempt to get in touch with them and get their feelings? Because I've heard a little snippet of Nick Saban talking about it on YouTube. I watched that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, Chrissy Hine eventually published a memoir in which she discusses her impressions and experiences on May 4th very sensitively and thoughtfully. I thought about reaching out to Nick Saban, but being a coach of a very distinguished football team, I didn't know how much time or willingness he would have to set aside to go over this with me. There were a lot of students there that day, and I think for all of them, as well as for all the guardsmen, it's a day that's burned in their memory. I remember a comment that one of the guardsmen who did talk to me made to me, because very moving. He said that every May, I close my eyes and I remember that day for every day of the month.
You have studied this time period as an academic. You remember it when it happened. You've been around, as you mentioned, the victims one way or the other, however defined, and some of the guardsmen. How did writing this book, or did it not, change your opinion of that day, perception of that day?
It enabled me to address and answer the lingering questions that had haunted so many for so long. Which was an order given to fire, and by whom and why? The reality of that is painful and tragic. Matt McManus shouted an order to fire in the air in an effort to prevent bloodshed. The practical consequence of that, though, produced a result which was terrible. And I think, too, the human costs of confrontation and violence, exemplified by the 9 student victims and the guardsmen who were traumatized and damaged in their own way as a result of all this. It's poignant. It just reminds you that in the United States, having Americans pitted against Americans, leading to violence between each other, is an utter tragedy.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor VanDeMark, are you ready?
I'll never be totally ready.
What was your first job?
Scooping ice cream in an ice cream parlor for the whopping wage of $1.15 an hour.
What was your first concert?
I think it was Peter Frampton.
Hey, that's pretty good. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
That's exceedingly difficult for me to answer. I wouldn't even presume to try to distill it to just one. The great religious traditions, the Bible, the Quran, the writings of the Buddha, they all address the same questions and try to come up with the same answers.
This may be a really hard one or a really easy one. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose? We'll give you Kent State as a free one, for lack of a better term, without being disrespectful.
Again, that's almost as difficult as one book. I'll give you 2 answers, though. As an American historian, having the cosmic privilege of sitting down and talking with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln would be at or near the very top of my list.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
This is an unusual answer. I would want to sit down and have a dinner conversation around one table with the recorders and microphones off and out of the room, where I could have a 3-way discussion between myself, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden privately.
And your message would be?
I would just want to listen and create an environment, an atmosphere in which the two of them would communicate with one another and try to understand the other. I think that's what's sorely lacking amongst so many people today.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Professor Brian VanDeMark. He is the author of several best-selling books. His latest, Kent State, An American Tragedy. By reading this book, not only did I understand this day, this May 4th, 1970, in a way that I never had before, I've come to understand its participants and its victims and our country in a way that I never had before. It's a terrific achievement. We're very grateful for your time. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.